Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a Learning and Growing webinar on Think Big But Start Small, the ADEPT teaching method. Our presenter today is Matthew Curtis of University of Southern California. My name is Sidra, and I'll be your moderator today for Hawks Learning. We will have a live Q&A session after the presentation, so please enter any questions you have into the Q&A module as we go, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end. I'll now hand it over to our presenter.
Great, thank you for that introduction. So happy to be here today to talk to you about the ADEPT method. I'm going to talk for about 15-20 minutes and then leave some time at the end for questions. I expect we'll be finished in about half an hour. So let me go ahead and turn on my screen share. You're welcome to type questions as I'm talking. If I see them, I will likely answer them in the moment. And like I said, there'll be time for questions at the end. Sort of short PowerPoint deck here, 14 slides. So think big, but start small. The ADEPT teaching method. So this ADEPT method is the idea that in our course, whatever our course is, there's usually big overarching concepts that link our lectures together or link and run throughout the whole course. And oftentimes as professors, we can get stuck on the big picture and forget that for our students who are usually often encountering these terms and concepts for the first time, we need to link them into their everyday lives and start off on a smaller scale rather than talking about the big picture immediately. So there's the ADEPT acronym is a fairly popular acronym because it applies to many situations. And oftentimes these acronyms have multiple definitions, but in this context, I'm using the ADEPT to stand for A for analogy, D for diagram, E for example, P for plain English, and T for technical. And the idea with this version of the ADEPT method is that it allows you to teach big, which don't have to be, but often are, difficult concepts to students because they're thinking about this big picture idea and linking smaller components together for the idea. So the advantage of the ADEPT method is it connects students with material, and it's breaking this complexity, whether it's complex because it's difficult or complex because it's made of lots of small, simple pieces. It's breaking it into smaller pieces. So I'm going to look at first at a concrete example of using this ADEPT method in the context of statistics. At Annenberg USC, I teach statistics and methods and marketing. So I'm going to look at it first in relation to an example from statistics, and then I will generalize it to look at some other concrete examples from marketing, from philosophy, chemistry, biology, and then teaching in general. So I recognize that won't get everyone's disciplines, but by doing chemistry, marketing, biology, statistics, it's probably getting many of you into areas that you teach, and arguably statistics applies to nearly any discipline we teach. Okay, so the ADEPT acronym, A for analogy. So when you apply your teaching via the ADEPT method, we would start out with an analogy. So in respect to standard deviation, we explain to our students, what else is this term like? So you can pick any example. Here I picked shooting arrows as a kind of random example, obviously outside the realm of statistics. We're looking here at the idea of shooting arrows. And if you shoot arrows and the arrows you shoot are all clustered together, that means you have a small standard deviation. And if when you shoot your arrows, there's a wide dispersion and wide range of accuracy, that would mean you have a high standard deviation. So again, even if you don't remember standard deviation from your high school or undergrad classes, haven't thought about standard deviation in 20, 30 years, hopefully this reminds you or shows you an example of what standard deviation is. So again, it's analogy is taking the thing you're teaching and showing them how it applies and works, an example of it in a situation that may be familiar to them, or in this case here, most of my students don't shoot arrows. They're typical undergraduate, graduate students, but they can relate and understand that this is an example of how standard deviation applies. Then we move into the D aspect, A for analogy, D for diagram. So then I do some sort of visualization. So it doesn't literally have to be a diagram, but a visualization. So keeping with our standard deviation example, I might draw a normal distribution. Distribution is kind of that hill that you've probably seen in multiple textbooks, a mound, a lump, a bulge, a hill. So I draw a normal distribution that has a narrow distribution. So it's a very steep, narrow hill. And this, I say this shows a low standard deviation, or I draw a normal distribution that's very wide. So it goes really along. And then there, I say this is an example of a high standard deviation. So again, there's other visuals I could have shown, but this is visualizing the D for diagram. Then we move on to the E for example. So here now we're in the E for ADEPT, and we're trying to connect it with this example, connect it to the students' everyday lives. So again, there's lots of examples you could give, but here the example is I say to the students, there's two classrooms, and the two classrooms take a test, and on this test, their scores are all the same. So classroom A and classroom B have the same average. But in room A, all the students score very close to the average. So the average is 85, and nearly all the students score between 80 and 90. So they're all very close to the average of 85. In room B, scores vary a lot. So the average is still 85, but the lowest score is now 60, and the highest score is a perfect 100%. So there's a lot of variation. So there's a high amount of standard deviation in room B, whereas room A, the scores are all very close to the average, so therefore we have this low standard deviation. So that's the A, D, and the E. So then we can move on to P for plain English. So this is tell it to the students in simple terms. So how much do scores differ from the mean, and how spread out the data is, and how much difference there is between scores. They're all three things are saying the same thing here, but it's taken this concept of standard deviation and putting it into simple terms. So I'm trying to avoid textbook language. I'm trying to avoid technical language. I'm trying to even avoid multiple syllable words. I'm trying to avoid complex sentences. It's almost like I'm explaining it to them like they're 5 years old. So without being patronizing, explaining it in the simplest terms that I can think of. So then we've done ADEP. So our last idea here is doing it as T for technical. So we're moving up. This is as simple as possible. Now we're moving into the technical definition, which in its simplest format is a textbook definition. I think I stole this from one of my textbooks. So I don't need to read it to you, but you can see here, what it's highlighting is it's complex sentences. There's technical definitions in here, dispersion, variability, quantifies. These are words that are not in everyday language for students, not even in everyday language that I use talking to colleagues. Unless I'm talking about a paper, I don't use dispersion, variability. And even if I was talking about a paper, I'm unlikely to use the word dispersion and variability. Even talking to a colleague, I'd say there's lots of variation, lots of differences between the scores. Even talking to a statistician, I would likely use that phrase. But the textbook definition, as we know, is nearly always technical and complex. So then we've run through the ADEPT of ADEPT analogy. What's it like? Diagram, visualizing it. Again, it does not need to literally be a diagram. Example, connect it to my, and by my, I mean connect it to the student's everyday life, not my life, because my life is probably very boring and uninteresting to the students. So connecting it to things the students care about. P for plain English, what's it in simple terms, and T for technical. So many of you, and this is not a good or bad thing if you are on or are not, are thinking, hey, I already do this a bit in my class already. And that's what I found. Before I was aware of the ADEPT teaching method, I was naturally doing this at times in my class. But by making it more deliberate and conscious, I can do it in a more orderly fashion by starting off with the ADEPT, A, then move into the visualization, then to the example, then to the plain English, then to the technical. And I found this works better for my students. Sometimes in my classes, before I was more deliberate and conscious, I'd start off with a technical definition saying, we're going to learn today about standard deviation. Here's the textbook definition. And it's not a bad way of doing it, but understandably, when students saw this slide, which is very similar to this, the definition, or I read the definition to them, it's very boring, it's uninteresting, they don't know why they should care, they don't have a way of integrating it into the knowledge structure. So having shown in the ADEPT, we're now going to run through 1, 2, 3, 4 examples from other disciplines. So I'll read through these. You can kind of compare them side by side. On the left side, we have marketing. So I looked at the concept of a logo. The philosophy, I looked at the concept of ethics. Again, I tried to pick aspects from these disciplines that relate to multiple disciplines, such as logo and ethics. Ethics applies to hopefully most disciplines. But with marketing, the analogy for a logo, the flag represents a country, the logo represents a brand. Diagrams, I might show a diagram or visualization of some logos, showing the importance of the imagery and the color palette, etc. Then I might relate it to their regular lives by showing examples of famous logos. We might point out some logos that are in the room or on their shoes, on their clothing, on their laptops. Plain English, visual representation of the brand, and it tells a story. The idea of the logos, it kind of tells the company's philosophy or their ideas. And the technical will be the textbook definition. So philosophy, it has some overlaps with marketing, but in some ways it's very different. And ethics is different from logo. So analogy, the compass, when we're lost, shows us the way. Ethics shows us the way to behave, to act, to go. Diagram, I might, so rather than being concrete like I did with the logo, with the diagram here for ethics, I might show some different theories and how the different theories relate to each other in respect to ethics. I might give an example here, the prisoner's dilemma. So the example of famous logos, that would usually be a fairly short illustration because you just point out some logos, ask them to name some logos. The students know what logos are. Whereas the prisoner's dilemma, if it's an intro to ethics class, they might have heard of the prisoner's dilemma, but most of the students, likely in my experience, will not have heard of it and not be familiar with it. Again, we don't need to know exactly what it is for this ADEPT teaching example, but this would take more time to talk about and explain to the students. Plain English ethics to me is what is right and wrong. Again, technical, you don't need to see a textbook definition of ethics, but I could then drop the technical definition up there on the screen. Let me just check the chat window because I see some messages coming in. These look all like greetings. So hello to everyone. So then 2 more disciplines are going now to the hard sciences of chemistry and biology. So chemistry, again, this is moving outside of my area of expertise. I'm marketing and statistics. So if I've made some errors here, I apologize, but to my lay person's understanding, these examples capture atomic theory and photosynthesis. So chemistry, atomic theory, the analogies, puzzle pieces fit together, and so do atoms. There's a way they have to fit together in a puzzle. There's a way they have to fit together in atomic theory. Diagram, I might show a visualization of the structure of the atom. Then my example would be some chemical reactions. Again, it could be real examples we do in the lab or videos I play of chemical reactions. And then plain English, explain it in simple terms. I wasn't feeling confident enough to explain atomic theory in simple terms myself, but the idea still holds. Then technical is the textbook definition. Biology, photosynthesis. So analogy, solar power makes energy, and so do plants. So photosynthesis is the plant's way of making energy from the sun, which is what the solar power is doing for us. Diagram, I show the process as photosynthesis. So examples of plants and algae in the pond creating energy using photosynthesis. Again, plain English, simple terms. Technical is the textbook definition. Okay, so we've got 4 slides left in about 5 minutes. So I think we're on track here. So then kind of going meta and thinking about how might you do the ADEPT teaching method via the ADEPT teaching. So how can I teach, if I was teaching teachers or trainee teachers or real teachers, how might I explain the ADEPT teaching method via the ADEPT method? So the analogy is the toolbox has tools. The ADEPT method is one tool in the toolbox. Many of us are using the ADEPT method already. This is, again, this is lecture, webinar, illustrations are trying to show you how to use it more deliberately and more consciously. Diagram, I might, so this is showing the ADEPT and how each component interacts and complements with each other. So plain English comes before the technical to help situate it in their knowledge structures. The example helps them connect it to a material they are dealing with in regular life or day-to-day lives or their working lives. So again, how the A, the D, the E, and the P and the T all complement, interact, and work together. They give an example of the ADEPT method, for example, slide 4 or 5 in this lecture about how to teach standard deviation using the ADEPT method, then plain English explaining the ADEPT method in simple terms, and then technical, the textbook definition of the ADEPT method. So going very meta, we're going to phrase this idea of showing what we're doing in what we're doing. And then our last few slides are now moving away from the concrete examples, thinking about some positives here of the ADEPT method. So you can adapt the ADEPT method, as we likely all do. We adapt our teaching style to fit the student's needs. So the examples might be visual or they might not. The analogy that you give might be sports, it might be music, it might be political, so the current Palestinian Hamas-Israel conflict, it might be the Russian-Ukrainian war, it could be something more happy and enjoyable, such as a local sports team or the college team winning, losing, could be about graduation, which is upcoming for many students right now. But you adapt it to be reflecting what the students care about. Taylor Swift album that just came out would be another way of maybe dropping an analogy in. And a benefit here of the ADEPT method is it promotes understanding rather than memorization, because by using especially the examples and the analogies, and sometimes also the diagrams in plain English, you're helping the students and encouraging them to integrate your course concepts into their existing knowledge structure. So rather than just memorizing things, and memorizing things can be important, but as we likely know, we can all literally memorize a phrase or an idea for a few seconds, an hour, a week. But then once the midterm has gone by, that textbook definition that they've memorized to pass the multiple choice quiz in my class quickly starts to fade away. Whereas if we can integrate it more into their knowledge structures and things they care and are passionate about, and to link and make comparisons themselves, it really helps them retain that knowledge. And they likely need that knowledge for their upper division classes or their internships or their jobs, which is the reason why we're teaching them this material, because we want them to go out and apply it and be more successful in their lives by having taken our class. So ways we can play with the ADEPT method. We can have students generate their own ADEPT. So once I wouldn't do this in the first few classes, but maybe around about my 5th or 6th meeting with them, which might be week 3 or week 6, depending how often you meet with your students, I might show them how I'm teaching them. So I might show them, so remember when we talked about standard deviation, I did this and this and this and this and this. I did the A, the D, the E, the P, and the T. I do this deliberately to help you integrate this information into your knowledge. So this week, or next week, or this lecture, we talked about variance, or we talked about correlation, or we talked about t-tests. I want you in class time now for the next 10 minutes to generate your own ADEPT for this concept of correlation or photosynthesis or whatever the concept is you're teaching. And if you're doing it in class, you might have the whole class work together. You might write the initials ADEPT on the board and have the class call out the analogy, call out the diagram, call out the example. Or you might break the class into individual work or pairs or groups, and then you can walk around the class checking in with the groups. One of the things I do when I lecture is I like to try and get away from being at the front of the stage, up on my podium, and walk around the class or lecture hall as much as possible. So you can see if you had a class of 50 students, you might break them into groups of 5 and say we're going to spend the next 10 minutes using this ADEPT method to define photosynthesis. And then I would wander around the class and look at what they're doing and then talk to groups, answer questions. And then by walking around the class, after the 10 minutes are up, I can come back to the front of the class, write the initials ADEPT on the whiteboard or on the projector, and then ask students to call out examples. Or I might even summarize and say, the group on the left, you had an interesting example for the plain English. And the group at the back, you had that analogy about Taylor Swift. Would you like to share with the class? And again, it helps me talk more intimately to the students and connect more with the students. And then our last slide is some additional variations to play around with this ADEPT. You can have the students share with each other. So rather than sharing to me at the front of the class, I say, you 5 in group A, go and talk to group B. You can pair them up or have the whole of group A talk to the whole of group B and say, tell the students in the other group, what was your analogy? What was your plain English? And as students are usually more comfortable talking to each other rather than talking out in front of the class. And again, that we have multiple conversations, it's harder for the student to zone out and be surfing the web if they're talking to each other rather than me summarizing at the front. You can split the class up, and you might have the left-hand side of the classroom do ADEPT for independent samples t-tests, and the right-hand side of the classroom do ADEPT for paired sample t-tests. Or you might have the left side of the classroom do the process for mammals, and the right side of the classroom do the process for insects. Just adapt it to reflect what your course concepts are. You can have the students submit it for homework or an ungraded exercise, and it starts to become a study guide. So if there's 50 students in the class, break them into groups of 4, and each group does one of the key components that are going to be on the midterm or the final. You collect them in and post it on Blackboard, your learning management system, Canvas, and the students have access to it as a study guide. Or different people do just the A for analogy, and different people do just the D for diagram. And then again, you bring it all together and you say, look, these group did 3 analogies, this group did 2 diagrams, this group did 2 technical definitions, and you bring it all together. So there's multiple ADEPT examples for the concept of photosynthesis. You can have the class vote on which analogy, which plain English, which technical definition was best. You can talk about the results, talk about the vote, explain what your perspective is after they voted, make them be critical thinkers about the aspects of the ADEPT. So if you do this a few times, they'll quickly become adept at generating analogies and diagrams, and then you can start giving them some critique about what you like about this analogy, what you like about this technical definition, or how this plain English example is missing some things. I think the voting could be public, anonymous, however you want to design it. And you can also challenge them with unusual additions. So you can say, this is how I've used ADEPT. Now I want you to use the ADEPT for Taylor Swift, or about why your baseball team always wins or loses, or ADEPT about how tired you are. So make it a little bit more challenging. I wouldn't do this the first time they run through it, but once you've done it a few times, if it's working for the class or you want to change it up, your students are smart, they are creative, and they can adapt this ADEPT example to apply to make their analogies and plain English all to be about Taylor Swift. And I think that should be my last slide. We're aiming for 20 minutes, so we're a little over. So now I can open up to all of you for questions in the chat window or the Q&A. Let me know if there's any questions you have.
There is one question. What is the typical student response to the ADEPT method?
So the typical response is usually they're a bit confused at first because it's, in my opinion, in a good way, taking them out of their comfort zones. People have not talked about the ADEPT method to them before. But once you explain it to the students, they recognize that many teachers, professors, instructors do components of the ADEPT before. And then once they start doing it, usually they report that it helps them connect to material. They thought they understood it. And again, you recognize this. You can think you understand something, but until you teach it to someone, that's when you're trying to teach it to someone, you realize that maybe you didn't know it as well as you did. So if I ask the students, do you understand what a correlation is? They all just nod. If I'm lucky, and I'll rate and say yes. If I'm extra lucky, I say, okay, if you understand it, now apply the ADEPT method to the correlation concept. And it really makes them think and reflect. And then you're going to get the questions from the students about, wait a minute, is this a correlation? Is that a correlation? And by making them think and reflect on it, the students usually report happiness because they're engaging more with their peers, they're thinking more about it, they're talking more about it. And again, I think many of us watching my colleagues teach and thinking about my earlier days of teaching, I think many of us are already doing the ADEPT method to an extent, but as Rubina just said in the chat window, it's making it more, hopefully more logical to you and making it more structured and making it more deliberate. And I know myself as a teacher, I sometimes often get lazy and just say what I want to say in class and start pontificating and just lecturing away without having the structure and deliberate intent. And the ADEPT method makes me more deliberate. And even if you've already lectured or talked about on the concept, and a student says, hey, I'm still confused about what a correlation is, I can give my recap or answer again using the ADEPT method and say, make sure I give an analogy, a definition, example, plain English, and then end with the technical. Because if a student's asking me a question and I go straight to the technical, oftentimes they're asking the question because they're confused, and the technical definition with its technical jargon and complex language is going to just shut them down and make them feel more confused or more, what's the point in asking a question? It's not really being answered. Yes, it's been answered, but it's not being answered in a way that helps me understand it. Okay. Any other questions?
We have one other question. Do you explain what the ADEPT method is to the students, or do you just go ahead and use it?
So I don't explain it in the first few weeks of the course. There's enough unusual things happening in my classroom usually anyway, from the students and from myself, that I don't I keep my first few lectures, I don't talk about the ADEPT method, but then in the third or fourth lecture I can say, remember last week when I talked to you about this concept, you might not have realized, but I started off with an analogy, then we showed you that visualization, then I gave you an example about how we're using it in politics right now, the presidential elections, and then I talked about it in plain English, and then we put the textbook definition out, the textbook on the slide. This is called the ADEPT method, and you're going to see this a lot in my classes as we go forward in multiple concepts. So again, if you want to make it more fun for the students, you can say, as we progress through today's lecture, if you see me use the ADEPT method, raise your hand and say, hey, professor, you're using the ADEPT method. And then you can make it again that way. Or I could say, next week, we'll be using the ADEPT method for this concept. And we're going to make it an interactive task. And I go back to that slide about playing around with having the students in the class generate the ADEPT methods. And before I said it for homework, I usually do the ADEPT method in the classroom to give some hands-on experience. They can ask questions. Whereas, as you know, if you set something for homework, I don't want a bunch of emails saying, hey, what's your ADEPT method? So by doing it in the classroom first, before having it for homework, they get more familiarity with it. I see in the chat window, Christina asks, have you applied the ADEPT method to scaffolding student writing? I can see where this would be useful. I have used it a bit with APA style. I don't teach a regular writing class or a general education writing class, but there's lots of writing in my classes. I think writing is important. Now, I'm lucky or unlucky that I teach graduate classes primarily. So there's lots of writing and minimal multiple choice situations in my class. So yes, I do teach writing. I've used the ADEPT method more about APA style in passing. But yes, I agree. I think it will be helpful in writing, especially certain types of writing where you're wanting them to give many writing papers, from my perspective, understanding informing a reader. So you can see how if you're telling the students to write a paper about the upcoming presidential elections, using the ADEPT method could be a useful way of writing an informational essay paper. Maxime, you're welcome, Christina. Maxime, ADEPT looks like an excellent teaching method. How can I apply it in teaching French? So how do you apply it in teaching French? So I think it would very much depend on what level of French you're teaching, whether it's a required class or an optional class. So let's say you're teaching French 101 and it's required. I might use the ADEPT method to explain to people who might not want to be in my classroom. So I wouldn't in day one say I'm using the ADEPT method, but I might say learning French is like giving an analogy. Learning French is like learning to play a video game or learning to play a board game or learning to ride a bike. It's going to be frustrating at times, but you're going to pick up material. And the more you do it, the easier it gets. And as you get more advanced at playing the video game, you can start doing more complex things. Such as you can start, I think the language terms, it's been a while since I took a foreign language. You can start breaking down the definitions of verbs and making sure your verb matches your subject. Then I'd show a diagram of a visualization. So I might show a visualization showing where, I don't know, where French originated. So again, I don't know the specifics here, but 3,000 years ago, language originated in the Middle East, and then people brought it across to Europe and evolved into Latin, and then Latin changed into the Renaissance Romantic languages of Italian, Spanish, and French, and modern day French starts to become recognizable in the year 1600, and there's been updates to the French dictionary, but here we are today in modern day French. Then you got the example. So this, I think the example would be a fairly quick example. I might put up some advertisements which are well known in America that use French phrases, or again, I don't know concrete examples, but I might pick up some words that we use in, like cul-de-sac is an American word, but my understanding is cul-de-sac originated in France. So I say, look, we already have French language in our vernacular, in our everyday lives. And then plain English, what is French and why it's important? And then I'm guessing the French government or the French dictionary has a technical definition of why French is important. So it's a very simplistic day one example of how the ADEPT method would apply in French. Rubina, can you talk about how you use it for the APA format, please? So it's been a while since I've done that, and in some ways it would be a little similar to the French example I just did. So what else is it like? APA style is like a coding language for computing, or it's a communication method on the acronyms, abbreviations you use when you're texting your friends. It's a way of communicating, manage information in a regularized format that people are familiar with. So rather than saying be right back, you write BRB, and rather than laugh out loud, you write LOL, and everyone knows what it is because everyone agrees on the same standards for these acronyms. That's what APA style is. A diagram, I think so a diagram is a visualization. So what counts as meeting this requirement is in a good way subjective. You don't literally have to have what everyone would agree would be a good diagram. I might show a visualization of an APA style title page, or I might show them 5 pages of a short APA paper, or even a student paper from last semester, if I had the student's permission, of what an APA style paper looks like. Just it allows them to visually connect with material and show them that helps the visual learners. Examples connecting to my everyday life. So the simple example that often gets shrugs and smirks from the students is, this is in your everyday life because you have to use it in my class. Or I might say, the journal articles you've been reading in all your other classes last semester and in your remaining time here at college, they're all using APA style. So getting familiar with this is important. Plain English, it's kind of self-explanatory, as is technical definition. The technical definition can probably come from the APA website. Plain English, this is a writing style we use to communicate in a universal language across multiple disciplines. Okay, I think we got everyone's questions. Did I miss anything, Sidra?
No, I think you got it all.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you found this useful. And I think in a good way, it's something you could use this afternoon in class if you want to do. It's kind of, you can ad lib with it. If you want to use the ADEPT method, you don't have to do all the components. Even you just did the analogy, the plain English and technical, it's still giving you structure for your spontaneous talking, and then you can make it more concrete and formal, dropping into PowerPoint slides if you want. You're all very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that looks like all the time we have for today. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you all for attending today. We will be emailing you a link to view the recording of this webinar once it's available. If you or any of your fellow instructors are interested in presenting for our Learning and Growing webinar series, please submit your proposals to the Learning and Growing website, which I'm going to link in the chat now for easy access. Yeah. These free webinars are brought to you by Hawks Learning, an innovative educational courseware company. To learn more about our mastery-based course materials and how Hawks can enhance learning outcomes for you and your students, please visit hawkslearning.com, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you.